Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Strategy to Mature Your Vendor Risk Management Program webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during the presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after this live session concludes. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss tools and techniques to guide you in improving your vendor risk management program, from governance documents to program maturity roadmaps. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our how-to guide developing and maintaining mature third-party risk management and governance documentation ebook, how to use the RACI method to determine third-party risk management responsibilities infographic and template, how to develop metrics in your third-party risk management program infographic, as well as a link to a library of additional resources, all in the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome, everyone. So today we are talking all about maturing your third-party risk management program, and we're going to start off just discussing what the attributes of a mature program are. Then we'll move into some steps and actions you can take and how to identify risks and things that might be getting in your way. We'll also talk about using a program maturity roadmap and measuring and reporting your success. We'll wrap up with some key takeaways, so let's jump right in. All right, so when we're talking about program maturity, what we're really talking about is the level of development, stability, and reliability of that program. And this is an important factor because it will help determine the overall effectiveness of the program in managing those third-party risks. When your program is mature, it means that it's gone through multiple iterations of development, testing, and improvement so that it's stable and reliable enough to effectively manage risk. Now, proper maturity really does matter for many reasons, but just to highlight a few. Mature programs are much better at identifying and mitigating risk, and they do that in a more optimized way, which in many cases means the program is not only really effective, but it's also really efficient. And that can affect or reduce the cost and resources necessary to manage those third-party risks in the long run. So what are the attributes of a mature program? Well, first of all, it's clearly defined. We know the processes we're going to use, the objectives, and all the goals. It's also documented. So not only are our process documented, but we have other documents like our policies and procedures, and training is available for anyone who needs it. Our processes are standardized and they're executed consistently across the organization. But those processes are also effective because they do what we need them to do. They meet the objective and they produce consistent outcomes. We also know that the processes are efficient, which means that they're not too difficult to execute. We can get them done in a manageable amount of time, and we don't have a lot of delays. Another thing we see in mature programs is a high level of adherence. That means that there's strong organizational awareness and compliance is the norm. We also see a lot of automation where manual workflows and processes have been automated whenever possible and practical. Programs that are mature are also measured. They have defined metrics to measure their performance. And those metrics and that performance is actually analyzed. This means we're regularly looking at how we're doing with these processes, how are we stacking up against our KPIs, and we're looking for opportunities to improve or make additions or implement new processes to continuously improve the overall program. So there's something I want to point out here. It may seem a little bit obvious, but before we can really be worrying too much about maturity, we have to really master the fundamentals, right? So I'm not going to read you everything on this slide, but it is important to understand that if you're still in those initial or implemented stage, that's fine. You need to focus on really honing in on those fundamentals, because if you don't have the basics down, it's going to be really hard to jump to more sophisticated improvements. So for the purposes of this webinar, let's assume that we all understand the basics and we want to move along the spectrum of maturity. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this here today, but because it's referenced several times in the presentation, I just want to highlight the third-party risk management lifecycle, show it to everyone so we're all on the same page. You know, as you know, the life cycle or the concept of a life cycle was really designed by financial regulators, but now it's been adopted as best practices across all industries. So just as a quick review, the life cycle is broken down into 3 stages, which are onboarding, ongoing, and offboarding. And in each stage, there are specific activities and steps that should follow a prescribed order. Now, when it comes to program maturity, that is going to mean a lot of different things for different people. But in my personal experience, over 20 years here, and through working with many peers and so many clients, I keep coming back to these 6 primary elements that really seem to contribute to program maturity. And these are the 6 components or areas that are going to give you the biggest lift most often. So from your framework perspective, those components include your governance documents, your processes, your metrics and reporting, and your tools and technology. But in a broader sense, we also have to consider governance and the people or the stakeholders involved, because they really do influence how successful your program is. So before we jump into each of these areas, we're going to take a short break for a poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, has your organization assessed the current maturity level of your third-party risk management program? Yes, somewhat for some processes, no, or not sure. Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Okay.
Do the regulators have specific requirements around program maturity?
They do not have specific requirements, so they're not explicitly spelled out in most of the guidance. However, there is an implied assumption there that you are going to take a perspective of continuous improvement. And what this looks like is that you consistently review, assess, and analyze new and evolving risks, that you're updating your processes and your requirements to mitigate those risks. So not only examiners, but your auditors will also look to see that that's happening, and if it's not, that could be a finding. in either an audit or regulatory exam is that the program is not mature enough or keeping pace with those new and evolving risks. So I hope that helps.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you will find our How-To Guide, Developing and Maintaining Mature Third-Party Risk Management Governance Documentation ebook. This is an in-depth guide that walks you through the governance documentation it's recommending in your organization. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
Now, we're going to start off with governance documents, and it's really important that everyone is on the same page around their purpose and their audience. And if we start at the very top here, you have your policy. And this is the document that formalizes all the rules and requirements and standards for third-party risk management at your organization. From there, we have what we call a program document or an operating guide. This is a comprehensive guide that's going to outline all the processes used to meet the requirements of the policy. It usually follows the life cycle and includes responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed information for each process. It also can outline the expectations of quality, accuracy, and timing. And it includes information about tools and technology. From there, we have stakeholder-specific procedures. And procedures are different than the policy because they're detailed instructions that explain how to execute a specific process. And they typically address just one stakeholder at a time. They should always be easy to understand and execute and ensure that you get the same outcome no matter who is performing the process. So, it's probably safe to assume at this point that most of you do have your third-party risk management policy and you probably have procedures. Less common is the program document. So this is going to be your first maturity strategy because a lot of people really don't understand just how useful this document can be. Now, this program document is not just for vendor owners or third-party risk management. It's really for all employees at all levels of the organization to really help them understand how third-party risk management works, how the processes connect together, what are the inputs and outputs. And this kind of document can really save you a lot of effort because it can allow people to self-answer all those questions you get over and over again. It also provides evidence of a really robust and healthy process for your auditors and your regulators. So if you're going to take on the program document, it's important to understand that this is a fairly big project. It does take time, but to avoid getting overwhelmed, you can work on one section at a time and put them together when you're ready. Now, what should you include in this document? Well, we want to start with all the purposes and objectives of third-party risk management in your organization. And we want to provide that overview of oversight and governance. We want to make sure we include our definitions for criticals, we get example, and we want to give a clear explanation of the risks associated with third-party risk management. So help your vendors understand the difference between operational risk, financial risk, business continuity risk, concentration risk. You also want to provide visual representations of the life cycle and explain each of the steps and stages within. When you're breaking down that life cycle, you want to make sure that you're giving a description of the activity. So, for example, what does the planning activity entail? What is its purpose? What are the required actions? And what inputs and outputs do we get from that activity? We also want to talk about who's responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed in this activity. We know that as sort of a RACI chart. Any timing or specific cadence associated to that activity, and what is the data that we're collecting from this activity, and how is it going to inform the next step? This is a really important thing to consider. This one piece of information can really help your stakeholders understand what it is you're doing in there. You're basically explaining how the sausage is getting made. Now, as you're putting this together, remember, nobody wants to read the narrative detail of everything. So to keep the document more informative and engaging, this is a great place to use charts, diagrams, workflows, anything that can really help communicate that information or that activity in a more effective way and doesn't require someone to read 20 pages that describe what due diligence is. Another thing to consider is that this is going to be a fairly hefty document. There's lots to include. So do yourself a favor and publish this in a digital format. Provide a dynamic table of contents so it's easier for folks to just go in and access the information they need. Always make the document accessible, and one thing I like to suggest, if it's appropriate for your organization, is include a link to the document in all your internal emails, in your signature line. That will help people remember where it is and reinforce the fact that this information is available to them. So as you're putting together your program document, or hopefully before, you're going to think about your processes. You know, those processes are the way that we achieve compliance with the rules and requirements that are in our policy. And the problem is that for most of us who've been building our third-party risk management program out for a while now, a lot of those processes might have been developed in isolation or in piecemeal, and their relationship to each other may not be that efficient or even functional with some of them. And that's because we have different factors, like we use new technology, we have organizational changes, we have changes in regulatory expectations. These all may influence how we've adjusted or updated those processes. But even the best design process is not going to be effective when it's not properly documented, tested, or communicated to the stakeholders that are responsible for them. All right, so that brings us to our second maturity strategy today, and that is the review and evaluation of your third-party risk management processes. Now, because, like I said, a lot of these things have been built piecemeal or maybe, duct taped together over time, we need to, at some point, sit down and really evaluate these processes just to make sure that they are effective and that they're doing what they're supposed to do. When we're looking at our processes, we want to evaluate them for 5 characteristics. So the first one is the purpose. Why are we doing this process? What requirements is it helping us meet? Does it align to our policy? Is it in alignment with the third-party risk management lifecycle? So it's a step in onboarding, for example. And does it have clear and expected outcomes? We also want to make sure that the process is well-defined. We understand the roles and responsibilities, the inputs and outputs, and any approvals for that process, and that we have a documented process map or flowchart. And we need to think about consistency. Is this process something that is executed consistently across the organization? Perhaps there are certain business units that do not follow all of these rules and requirements. Maybe you have an offshore office that may do things a little bit differently. It's important to recognize that and really understand how those exceptions are managed. And of course, we're going to evaluate for effectiveness and efficiency. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, the number one question I'm going to ask about every single process is, does it help identify, assess, manage, or monitor third-party risks? The answer for 99% of your processes should be yes. We also want to think about how we know if the process is working as intended. Has it been tested? If not, how do we detect failures or errors? We also need to think about how often we have to do process workarounds or make exceptions, because the higher that occurrence of exceptions, the lower the effectiveness of the process. Of course, you want to think about efficiency. How easy is it to complete this process? And can we reasonably predict how long it should take? Have we gone through and eliminated all those bottlenecks, any unnecessary approvals or steps or reviews that are just slowing it down? Of course, we automate whenever possible. And if you're not sure about your efficiency, check in with your stakeholders. Now, but not only do we need to look at the processes for those specific attributes, but we need to think about how the processes work individually in relation to each other. We need to understand their flow. When do they start and stop? We also want to make sure the processes are relatively aligned to that life cycle. And if you don't have them, it's so important to create documented process maps or workflows, because this is going to be instrumental in helping you refine those processes or spot issues. We also want to make sure processes are tested and that we use a variety of stakeholders in that testing, and then that we get their feedback, right? Because if they're having issues following a process, it usually means there's a problem. Now, we also want to keep our eyes open for any hidden issues. One might be is that it's really difficult to reasonably estimate the time frame that this process will take. Again, we might have low internal compliance, or we're seeing a lot of requests for exceptions, right? That means that something is not effective or efficient. And if we have to go back and rework or retool or do manual adjustments for the output of that process, there is usually an issue. Now, let's move into our next area of opportunity, which is metrics and reporting. Now, we all know that we have to have reporting as sort of a baseline requirement for a successful third-party risk management program. And I can assume that a lot of you already have reporting, but to make it more meaningful, of course, we need to have metrics to help us measure and compare the data that we're reporting, so it's more meaningful and have a context for the stakeholders so that they can stay informed and make decisions, right? We can use qualitative or quantitative metrics, but we need to do something more than just here's a number, right? So as this is an immediate webinar, we can already assume that you have a lot of baseline reporting that you use every day. But in mature programs, reporting becomes more fine-tuned and reports are established to meet certain objectives. So if we look at the types of reports you really need or might need to develop, we can think of them in 4 basic categories. The first category includes the reports we use to manage the actual vendors and their individual engagement. So that might be your inherent risk, your due diligence, etc. The next category are the reports that you need to help you run your day-to-day third-party risk management function. So these reports are going to support all your processes to ensure that they're getting done on time and that the quality is as expected. They also serve to hold people accountable. The third category, and potentially one of the most important, are those reports that we use to manage risk from the macro level down to the micro level. This means that we can understand where risk is present and evolving and are able to look at it from different perspectives, like for a specific type of product or service, or a particular risk, say cybersecurity. Where does that exist in the engagement or at the relationship level, business unit, or the enterprise? Now, finally, you have reports to tell you how the program is functioning overall. And these reports should indicate if your program is meeting its objectives, managing risk as a whole, demonstrating regulatory compliance, and detailing your resource capacity and management of those resources. As a best practice, it's not only important to have all these different reports, but also understand and articulate the ways you're going to use them, which stakeholders they're going to be shared with, and how often you need to generate them. All right, as I mentioned earlier, to make those reports effective, you need to have some context for the data that you're reporting, and this comes in the form of metrics. Now, we talked about what makes a program mature. Let's take a minute to examine what goes into developing an effective metric. So the first thing is it's aligned to your strategy. It has a direct correlation to your objectives. It's transparent and easy to understand. So I can look at that number and I can quickly discern what action I should take, or if I should be concerned or not. I know what it means. They're also comparative, right? Because metrics are not just numbers. They allow us to compare one thing to another, or across segments, or across time. So they help us understand progress of improvement or decline. They also can use ratios or ranges because they provide more actionable insights than absolute numbers, because they can help you identify sort of trends and underlying issues or performance. Another attribute of an effective metric is it's always reliable, so it's based on accurate data and we're using the same measurement system each time, which adds to the consistency, right? We want to make sure that we're using that same metric over a period of time. We don't change what we're measuring in the middle of the game and expect people to understand what they should feel or do. Context is really important. Let's say you have a bunch of metrics that are all based on the same measurement. So we're looking at a percentage or a scale of 1 to 10. That may not be the best way to actually measure that particular data element. So we have to really think about, is this best answered as a yes or no? Should we use a scale of 1 to 5? Should we use a risk rating scale? Should we use a percentage? Most importantly, a really effective metric is going to help you change behaviors because it's easy to understand. People can instantly know what it is they're supposed to know and potentially do, and then take action to drive improvement.
Our second poll question of the day is, has your organization developed and implemented reporting and metrics to measure the health and stability of the third-party risk management program? Yes, somewhat, no, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here from the audience that we can answer.
Great.
Who should be responsible for developing third-party risk management program metrics? Is that something ERM does?
Well, that's going to depend on your organization. So what I like to recommend is that the third-party risk management team or the folks responsible for that function are really the ones beginning that process to identify and establish those metrics. Now, of course, we do need some feedback about those metrics. We need to make sure that they're telling the right story. So it's highly likely your management or another department, maybe that's enterprise risk management if you don't already report in there, or operations, somebody's taking a look at those metrics and saying, yeah, this makes sense. This is the right thing to measure to help us understand the risk. But it isn't necessarily the responsibility of another department to create that. It should be more of a collaboration, and at the very minimum, have enterprise risk or the risk management function review those metrics with you just to make sure they're telling the right story and really helping you manage risk. I hope that is helpful.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. In the related content widget, you will find our How to Use the RACI method to determine third-party risk management responsibilities infographic and template. Hillary, back to you.
All right, as your reporting capabilities mature and expand, you're going to find that you have a lot of different reports with a lot of different information that serves different purposes. And that's excellent. However, Sometimes there can be an unintended consequence with all that reporting floating around people can get distracted from, or all that information can dilute that key risk reporting that we're trying to do. So your next strategy is to develop an elevated risk report that solely focuses on those risks that are most serious and have the most dramatic impacts to the organization. And we're going to publish it on a regular basis. We want to think about things like critical vendor issues, capacity, performance declines, etc. All right, so you're getting ready to put together your report. What do you need to think about? Well, the first thing is, what are we going to use as KPIs or KRIs that are going to help the viewer or the person getting that report really understand where the biggest risks are and what those potential impacts might be? We also should include those risk tolerances or ranges or thresholds so that it's easy to determine if the risk is approaching a non-acceptable state or it's gone beyond that acceptable threshold. You should be thinking about what actions you expect to be taken as a result of this information and who is responsible for doing the action and who's accountable for making sure it gets done. We also might want to think about who might need to weigh in or who just needs the information in general. Just like any other report, we need to make sure all that data is reliable and consistent and that it's easy to get so that we can create the report without a lot of hassle and manage those risks appropriately. And that is the perfect segue into our next area of opportunity, which is tools and technology. That's because your tools and technology are going to really enable all that data collection and gathering. And when we think about tools, we should think about things like risk assessments, vendor questionnaires, the methodology you use to create your risk ratings, standardized list of due diligence documents or preferred contract terms and conditions. And these tools are usually enabled through the technology. So our third-party risk management platform, risk intelligence services, and APIs, which allow your system to talk to other systems internally, like your accounts payable or maybe your contracts management system. Now, there's a lot on this slide, but I do want to quickly touch on some of the other tools and technology that you should be considering as part of your maturity efforts. One is your information gathering tools like your inherent risk assessments and vendor risk questionnaires. You need to keep those updated to make sure that they're reflecting the most recent risks, such as AI, fourth party, regulatory updates. Along with that, we need to keep that list of due diligence documents updated and standardized. So when those risks appear, we have the right documentation request for the vendor. Don't forget your contracts. Obviously, they're most effective when you can use your company's template and it has all the required information. But a lot of times we cannot use those templates. We have to use a terms of service agreement or something else. In those cases, it's really instrumental to have a list of your required terms and conditions and note the ones that are not covered by your contract that you couldn't negotiate, because that's going to help you identify what other actions you need to take to help mitigate that risk. And finally, your APIs. These are the connectors between disparate data systems. So having the ability for your third-party risk management system to connect, for example, to your AP system can be invaluable because that other layer of data is going to help you make better decisions and take action. Okay, so we are at our fourth maturity strategy for tools and technology, and if you are not already doing this, utilize professional risk intelligence. This is such a game changer, and I can tell you it can be used for point-in-time reports as part of your initial due diligence. It can be used for monitoring your third parties, and it can also be used to monitor those fourth and nth parties you might be a little concerned about. The important thing to remember here is you do not need a contract with the vendor you're monitoring. You can monitor for a wide range of risk domains, and often these services can be integrated right into your third-party risk management platform. Many of them will provide some sort of action or recommended action to take when risks are elevated, and they'll also provide context as to why the risk is elevated. This beats the heck out of trying to set up multiple internet news alerts that may or may not be relevant or accurate. So if you're not doing this today, take time to investigate the professional risk intelligence services that are out there. You know, I want to talk about governance for just a moment. We know that it's a foundational element of any mature third-party risk management program. And we also know that regulators have a lot of expectations around governance. Now, ultimately, the board of directors and senior management, they're responsible for that governance. But the truth is, we cannot rely necessarily on the board or senior management to help us manage those day-to-day risk issues or solve problems. So ultimately, there is a little bit of a gap between what's going on at the third-party risk management program level and the support that we need that lies in that space in between the program and the top of the house. So your next maturity strategy is to leverage your risk committees. Risk committees are tasked with providing this independent layer of oversight across the organization, and they're usually comprised of a lot of different stakeholders who have quite a bit of influence in multiple areas like operations, finance, legal and compliance, risk management. And their responsibilities include making sure that there is alignment with the company's risk objectives. They are helpful to identify significant or emerging risks overall. They're monitoring compliance, and they are communicating that information back up to senior management and the board. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I want to point out two things in particular. The first is your third-party risk management team, the most senior member of that team, should have a regular seat at that risk committee table, right? They need to be a member. This is so that the committee can help contextualize some of those third-party risk management issues into that broader framework. They can help incentivize compliance. And most importantly, they can provide feedback and perspective. So often we're a little heads down thinking, you know, the world's going to explode if A, B, and C doesn't happen for third-party risk management. But having that conversation across a broad variety of stakeholders can help you really get some perspective and figure out the best way to move forward. Now let's talk about our last area of focus, and that is people. People are potentially one of the most important components to a successful program. I like to say if people are the doers, they can just as easily be the undoers. So let's think about what we need to be providing as part of a mature program to support people. So the first one are clear roles and responsibilities. The second is education and training. We need them to understand the purpose and objectives of third-party risk management, which is the why. We need to help them understand all the rules, tools, and processes. That's the what. And we need them to know the how to actually accomplish these tasks and activities. People also need feedback and communication to make sure that they feel heard and respected, and that feedback is making its way into process improvements and keeping everyone informed. Collaboration is also incredibly important because it makes us better problem solvers. And one thing that you can do for your program when it comes to collaboration is to change your mindset. Commit to being a consultant, a coach, or a mentor, not a cop, not a babysitter, and not an enforcer. That one mental shift will really help you in your program overall. Now, I do want to focus on vendor owners as part of the people component today. because what they do is so essential for the success and well-being of the program. Now, vendor owners, again, are those folks. Typically, they sit in the line of business, and they are somewhat responsible for the product or service being delivered by the vendor. So therefore, they own that vendor relationship and all of the risks that come with it. They're responsible for managing that risk. You may call them something else at your organization. They could be a vendor manager or third-party risk owner. Whatever you call that, it's essentially the same role. Whoever is responsible for managing those risks associated with the vendor. So when it comes to people, vendor owners in particular, we need them to fulfill their role and responsibilities and take care of that vendor owner work. We need to hold them accountable. Now, if you're wondering why, let's look at this example. We have Jake and Alice. Both are product managers and both are also vendor owners. Now, Jake knocked it out of the park with his product work, but from his vendor owner responsibilities, not so much. He left some stuff undone. He caused a lot of headaches for the third-party risk management and legal teams, and we got an audit finding. Alice, on the other hand, did an amazing job with her product work, but she also did a really great job with her vendor owner work. So when we're thinking about this, who is really the better employee here? Who should get that raise or bonus? If we're not holding vendor owners accountable for this work, it's not going to be a priority for them. So your next strategy is to implement at least one performance objective related to vendor owner responsibilities on performance plans or performance objectives. Now, a key thing to keep in mind is this is not something you can just do on your own. We should engage the risk committee and the HR team to make sure that this is acceptable and to develop those actual KPOs. Now, here's some examples. They don't have to be overly complicated, but they should be there. And you can also work with your HR department to make recommendations on how these objectives should be weighted in the overall evaluation. So now that you have some ideas of some ways that you can possibly implement some maturity strategies, we need to think about our roadmap. Now, we do need a maturity roadmap to help our stakeholders understand what we're doing and arrange those efforts in a stepwise and incremental plan. This is really important because it can help people understand the timing and the big picture. As part of developing your roadmap, you want to think about the maturity level of each process or component in the program. So this is a pretty baseline maturity matrix, and this can be very helpful in determining exactly where your program is in that scope between initial and optimizing. And one thing I love here is it's color-coded. If you've attended my webinars, you'll know that I like to present data visually whenever possible, and color coding can be very helpful in explaining where we are in the process. So let's look at a sample maturity roadmap. Okay, so this is a very basic maturity roadmap that could be created in Excel or Word or even PowerPoint. It's very simply a grid where we're listing the components of our program on the left and the activities that we'll be doing on each line. Now, each line is also color-coded to help whoever is reviewing the roadmap see where we are on that spectrum of maturity. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this looks great, but do we actually need this tool? And yes, there are a couple of reasons you do, but the main one is that there is really a lot that goes on in your risk management program, and there's a lot to do. So there's so many processes and there's so many stakeholders, it's really unlikely that anyone but the third-party risk management team is going to be able to understand them all or recall them all at any point. Your maturity roadmap can be part of your reporting to the board, and it can be part of your annual budget request. It can help show your auditors that you know exactly what needs to occur to get over the hump and move into the next improvement stage. But it can also be used in those risk committee meetings to help drive transparency and keep everyone informed. But most of all, it can help you identify where you might have dependencies for what items need to be fixed before you can move on to something else. So, as I mentioned, include this roadmap in your annual update to the board, any budget requests, and as part of the regular discussions with risk committees, and of course, your regular management.
Our third and final poll is, we have implemented a roadmap to chart third-party risk management maturity or improvement initiatives. Yes, we're developing one now. No, we're not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
All right, let's do it.
Right. You mentioned having a C-level champion for third-party risk management. Which C-level role should do that?
Well, it really should ideally be the C-level executive who is responsible for risk at your organization. That's not to say that there's always a chief risk officer. Those responsibilities may fall underneath another executive. So ideally, it would be whoever is responsible for sort of enterprise risk, the risk function overall at your organization. But depending on how your organization is structured, you may also want to look at the executive who is directly your reporting executive. So if third-party risk management reports into sourcing and procurement perhaps, and they report into finance, then that would be a good choice. But your first choice should always be that risk management executive if that's possible at your organization. But the most important thing is that you have an executive champion. You need someone at the top of the house to sort of advocate for you, support the program, and help communicate some of those bigger risk issues to the board or to the CEO when necessary. I hope that's helpful.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before continuing, I would like to remind everyone that we have our How to Develop Metrics in Your Third-Party Risk Management Program infographic available for download in the related content widget. This is a great resource to grab as we briefly discuss different metrics, and this resource walks you through that. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
So if you're doing all this hard work to move your program forward and drive continuous improvement, it's important to keep your stakeholders updated and keep the board and senior management involved. We just don't want to talk about what we're going to do. We want to show how those efforts are going, if we have any big challenges and any successes that we had. So it's important to develop and implement some metrics, report on them quarterly. You want to provide that progress report for your roadmap at least twice a year, and provide reporting for stakeholders engaged in those improvements. And by the way, don't forget to acknowledge their efforts and say thank you. All right, it is time to wrap up. So here are some key takeaways for you today. Of course, focus on those fundamentals because you need those mastered before you can start working on maturity. But once you're ready, you can start developing that program document, reviewing your processes, and developing your reporting to make sure that it's helping you accomplish certain objectives like managing your day-to-day third-party risk management function, helping vendor owners manage their vendors, and informing the board and management about the health and stability of the program. You also, with that reporting, consider that elevated risk report so that you can streamline and focus that information so people can be informed and act. For your ongoing monitoring, really consider those risk intelligence solutions to support that process and participate in your risk committee. Remember, the senior manager of the third-party risk team should have a seat at the risk management table. Also, make sure you are holding your vendor owners accountable. Really try and get those performance metrics implemented and standardized across your organization. When you're all complete, make sure that you do a maturity roadmap so that people can see what you're doing and share your achievements with your stakeholders. And don't forget to say thank you to those folks who helped you along the way. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen.
Great, thank you so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time and sharing some important information. On your screen now, you'll see our upcoming webinars. On June 4th, our vendor complementary user entity controls, what they are and how to use them to protect your organization webinar. And on June 6th, our how to read and review a vendor SOC report, a report walkthrough webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, what type of action would you take on the bad reviews that come out of risk intelligence, and how can we bring the information back to the third party if it isn't built into their contract?
That's a really great question, and there's a lot to know about risk intelligence. And one of the things is that most of the risk intelligence service providers, they are using really complex algorithms to gather a lot of disparate public information and put it together into a profile, which then will translate into a risk alert. When you do receive an alert or something negative, the first thing is to completely read the report that the service has given you and to make sure you understand what's contributing to that report. Now, once you have that, it is perfectly acceptable to go out and ask your third party, hey, I got this alert. Do you want to give me some context? Do you want to give me some information? Hopefully, they will be able to provide that for you. In the case of a fourth party, you can ask them, I've received this information about your fourth party. Now, you don't have to have that in your contract. This is just a discussion. It's a way you manage risk. Most vendors will be very eager to respond and either address the issue or tell you how they're remediating the risk, or they'll be really interested in what you're looking at, and that will help improve them for the future. So I hope that answers that question.
Great. Our next question. What are some best practices to demonstrate maturity level to auditors?
So having those roadmaps that I mentioned at the end of the webinar can be a really valuable way to show that when you've identified what your priorities are and that you've actually mapped them out across time and that you've had accomplishments there, they will see that continuous improvement mindset. Also, maturity, a lot of how they're looking at maturity is how well your processes are functioning. Are they effective? Are they efficient? Are they documented? Having those things aligned, those attributes we talked about, to your processes is another excellent way to demonstrate that maturity. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Next question. At what stage of program maturity should you investigate report automation and usage of more visual elements versus stock standard PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets?
Personally, I'm a fan of all things visual. Nobody wants to read a long report, and sometimes it can be hard to interpret. So I would say if you have the capability within your system, to start investigating that as soon as it's possible. Your reports are something that's always going to evolve and change. So there are some reports, for example, of vendor inventory. You can't really represent that visually except at a very high level. So some reports are just not going to lend themselves to sort of that graph and chart. But I would just start as soon as you can. Ultimately, your stakeholders are going to be appreciative because it really limits their investment in trying to decipher that activity. It will take less time. So that's my recommendation.
Great. Our next question. There is no way we could ever force our product managers to have performance objectives for their vendor risk management work. Do you have anything else to suggest?
Yeah, so I realize, because I hear this a lot, this is somewhat controversial or gives people a little bit of heartburn, but before you say there's no way, I would ask you to do a couple things. One is to work with your accounts payable department to figure out just exactly how much money you have under management in these relationships. and use that as part of your discussion around why this is necessary. So for example, let's go back to Jake in our example. Let's say that he is responsible for managing a vendor who's worth about $2.5 million to the organization. It kind of seems unreasonable that he wouldn't be held accountable for managing the risk to that investment. So that's one thing I'm going to try. However, if your organization's just not there yet, or you're not getting that support to drive that, really push it through reporting. Make sure that people are being held accountable through reporting, and that those reports are not only going to their management, but they're getting escalated and they're part of that risk committee discussion and ultimately that reporting to the board. So I hope that's helpful.
Great. Our next question. If we are developing a program guide, what types of process maps are best?
So process maps come in all flavors. Just, there's what we call a workflow or a swim lane chart. There's, Six Sigma has its own process mapping that measures all the inputs and the outputs and the owners, et cetera. What I find is most effective are what I would call a swim lane chart, which shows all of the roles of the stakeholders and how the process moves in and out through those different stakeholders. So without being able to demonstrate that, if you have any questions, look up swim lanes. I think these are very effective, and they really show those handoffs and inputs and outputs. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, great. Our next question. We are not regulated, so do we have to have all the processes on the life cycle?
So this is a really great question, and I want everyone to understand that the life cycle may have been initially created by financial regulators, but the life cycle itself and adhering to that life cycle is now a widely accepted best practice. And the reason for this is each of the activities on that life cycle is going to help you appropriately identify, assess, manage, or monitor that risk throughout the relationship. And each activity in the life cycle is going to inform the one that comes after it. Excuse me. So the information that we gather in that risk assessment, for example, that initial inherent risk assessment is going to tell us the level of risk and if it's critical or not. That information then informs processes like due diligence. Due diligence is going to help inform what we have on the contract. And the contract is going to inform how we monitor and manage that vendor moving forward. So even though you're not regulated, following that life cycle and really taking advantage of each of those activities is recommended. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources related to program maturity. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of Endminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.